This is loud enough for you guys? Alright. Cool. Okay, hi everyone, welcome to the quarterfinals of the Malaysian Nationals 2016. I'd like to congratulate all teams for making it this far. In opening government, we have UM. In opening opposition, we have HELP A. In closing government, we have Mara B. And in closing opposition, we have Taylor's JT. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to speak at the motion that stands in their name. Here.
As an atheist, we prefer a world in which we could criticize religion externally, clearly point out the flaws and harmful tenets of religion that has long oppressed individuals who don't subscribe to mainstream religion, minorities that have been kept out of doors of churches, mosques, and temples. What is the status quo of this motion? Pope Francis is now the current Pope of the Vatican. He's the leader of the Catholic world, and he's considered one of the most liberal popes out there, in comparison to Pope Benedict and other popes, right? Catholicism used to be a very popular religion. Even in the U.S., there are 80% of Catholics there, right? And it has slowly reduced as atheism and as liberal values become more popular. What is our stance coming from self-opening government? We prefer a world in which we don't like the concessions that Pope Francis tries to make and injecting liberal values into Catholicism, because he has made concessions in the media talking about how these are the things that the Catholics stand for. Like, for example, number one, he's very ambiguous in what kind of liberal values that he prefers. For example, homosexual is still a sin, and we should not allow them to marry, but we should not condemn them as well. He's also very ambiguous about the values of abortion. Women they should be able to access abortion, but only if they are affected. For example, they have Zika virus, right? Contraceptives are only afforded to these individuals. Therefore, we also don't really know. He was also very ambiguous in this sort of thing. Number three, he's also very ambiguous in climate change, right? He talks about how, yes, climate change is a problem, but maybe God has played a part in it. So we don't think that ambiguous concessions like this is very productive, any form of discourse when it comes to liberal values or when it comes to a stance as an atheist. We think that mixing liberal values into Catholicism muddles up the discussion about the separation of these two things, and also how it stops us from criticizing the religion externally, because we think that it can affect us internally. You can reform religion internally as well. Right? Why is it ineffective from side opening government? We think that more liberals are persuaded in thinking that we could reform Catholicism from within when Pope Francis makes this kind of statement, or when Pope Francis makes this kind of concession. Now we see that they are not only the world is not only enchanted by the fact that Pope Francis is one of the most liberal popes out there. We think that there are still problems within the Catholic Church that continuously to oppress individuals and not allow individuals and not fully engaging with the discussion, right? Like, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church, a Catholic church, still continuously to oppress individuals, still talks about how gay people should die and abortion should not be allowed. Liberals, a majority of Christians still think that there are certain conservative values still should be kept, and think that this kind of concession is enough already. I'll take over.
All your harms are literally what happened to the Anglican Church in the past 50 years, and right now they're one of the most liberal churches accepting homosexual marriage and women to be bishops.
The only reason why these things happen is because we are able to criticize it externally, having social movements like civil rights movement, the feminist movement. These are things where it's happening externally that influences the church to change, because they need to pander to society to remain relevant. Right? That's how we become more liberal. Sit down, I've already taken. We think that the conflation with liberal values into Catholicism, like what Pope Francis said, is very harmful because it's very ambiguous. And we don't think that we don't think that we could change that internally, right? We think that there are also harmful things in his ideology where he tries to defend his stance, he tries to defend his ambiguous stance. We don't think that he's able to inject any form of liberal values and at the same time oppose harmful tenets of Catholicism that continues to oppress individuals on the ground. Why is it harmful? Number one, we think it muddles up the discussion about rejecting religion, right? Obviously, this debate also has to assume as a stand of atheism. Because this concession that the Pope makes seems like it's a sufficient concession made by the conservative Catholics, that the world is, that liberals will be okay with this kind of concession, right? But this also harms the discussion in which how atheists and liberals should reject religion of the amount of the history of oppression caused by the Catholic Church. So we think that as an atheist, we try to separate these two things and talk about how this concession is not sufficient. Why is it not sufficient? Number one, what happens now, right? Number one, we cannot externally openly criticize religion because we think that the concession has already made. But number two, we have less incentive to launch campaigns to lift people off any form of oppression caused not only by the Catholic Church but as a religion as a whole, right? Because more often than not, we put so much resources, so much of our time and airtime to talk about the oppression that was caused by religion. Look at the psychological trauma that religion has put us through, right? That the churches have kept us out and not accepting us and telling us that because you not only don't subscribe to mainstream religion, but you don't subscribe to the conservative societal norm that we preach. So Pope Francis' concession now makes liberals think or atheists think that this concession is enough. Therefore, we don't think that we should then heavily launch campaigns to lift people off oppression, right? Let us not forget the amount of trauma that this oppressed individual has gone through. Number three, we think that it also stops resources channeling into lobbying for anti-religious groups who think that the middle ground that Pope Francis has given us is enough to work with. We don't think that the thousands and thousands of years of indoctrination is going to change if Pope Francis makes this kind of ambiguous stand, right? I think that in order to be very clear in how we deal with minorities and deal with oppression, we need to separate these two. Number four, we think that it also lessens the ability for us to attack Pope Francis because the world is so enchanted with the idea that he's able to then liberate us, and we have the perception in which that can happen. Before Pope Francis talks about homosexuality, right? In the 1980s, 80% of individuals in America thinks that gay people should go to jail and that they should be stoned to death. Right now in 2014, we give them 2015 the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage should be legal. These things aren't because of the doings of Pope Francis, right? Because we externally not only talk about the oppression of how the religion puts gay people into this problem, but we think it's all external forces in which we are able to criticize the problem which the religion has put us through, right? Like how Planned Parenthood, we continuously to lobby for rights for abortion. It is not because Pope Francis has made this concession. As an atheist, we think that the concession that Pope Francis made is not only, number one, very ambiguous, but very harmful in the muddling up with the discussion about how we should reject religion and how the amount of harm that religion has caused. I'm very proud to stand in the
Thank the Prime Minister. To continue the debate, we invite Leader of Opposition.
Atheists are now everywhere. The movement now and everyone now starts to reject religion, and everyone lives in very different countries, in very different contexts. In opening government's context, all they argue about is that Pope Francis is a leader of institutionalized religion that is very powerful and popular. Hence, his influence of power is then still very huge and very enormous. The problem with is that you have to take into account of atheists who live in conservative societies like these. The fact that in Philippines they do not allow condoms was very harmful to the economy and the country itself, because there were little to no planned family or any planned parenthood sort of movement within the state. Hence, if you want to pander to make pragmatic outcomes of how atheists should be accepted, and this is what society openly opposition wants to fight for, then when atheists actually denounce Pope Francis, who is largely accepted, even though he faces backlash from some Catholics, is largely accepted by the new generation of liberal or more open-minded Catholics, and hence still then will be able to gain traction and gain more support, or at least a sense of integration within the Catholic community, especially for atheists who live in these kind of communities and suffer ostracism every single day. What has opening government proved to you is that Pope is ambiguous in liberal values and all of this. The thing is, however, the sustainability of integration and not denouncing Pope Francis is something that is good. Why? Or something that is inherently good, because we are able to then talk to these people about it and actually openly discuss and instead of criticize. The fact that she comes from a point of criticizing just means that you are attacking them, and it's an ad hominem attack. An attack for religion, an attack for cultural identity is something that is very harmful, and these people will be more defensive. What on your side makes you think that now these people will accept you? And how are you going to harm the atheist movement within conservative societies? Secondly, she didn't exactly prove to us as to what does she want to eventually inculcate, whether it's mobilization of atheist movements or integration, or how does this segregation actually benefit the atheists overall. The fact that the continuation of segregation and hatred will most likely to occur, and this means that less understanding or even less people accepting of atheism will then happen, and atheism eventually will not then be normalized within status quo. These Catholics are obviously more conservative, and hence they are very protective of their identity. And what will then they allow? Something that doesn't and misrepresent and Catholics always misrepresent atheism within their own communities as well. What makes you think that if you ask them to hate us even more, they are going to then try to talk to us or interact with us as they did in the olden ages when Pope Benedict strictly hates atheists and just say that we support Satan and things like that. So how are you then going to change this narrative within the Catholics' minds, especially when indoctrinated for so long by these people, and Pope Francis as the new age and new era of a more liberal Catholic will then be able to occur. Before that, yes.
By virtue of your defensive conservative context, wouldn't identifying as an atheist already get the rejection and the backlash that you're talking about?
Yes,
exactly. That's why, in your case, you are more likely to be harmed if you denounce Pope Francis as a whole. Why? Because in your case, you are then surrounded by all of these conservatives and the hatred is towards you. When you say that, I sort of agree with what Pope Francis says, then it's more likely to get a common ground between these people, and secondly, something that is, even though it's something very small, a very small concession, but it's still something that is good, and something that can start a talk or just start to interact with them. And hence it's a lot better than how it was in the older ages when they just stoned them to death, or even so disregard them of policies that actually help the nation. Now, but you also want to talk about the mobilization of movements. When you want to talk about it, you have to take into the context of people in both the more liberal and more conservative context. When you want to mobilize a context within a liberal state, it's a lot easier because you have the critical mass and support, and the political structure will most likely suit you. But whereas in a conservative community, for example in Kenya, these kind of things are very hard for you to mobilize, because once you state that I'm an atheist, you are Satan worshipper. You are not of God's child, and eventually you'll then just be singled out because everyone has the same identity and shares the same common ground, and you do not then want to interact with them even on that basis. How are you going to change or mobilize an atheist movement which is universal, and how are you going to help atheists eventually? Now, moving on to my substantives, as to how, as atheists who believe in equal economics and equal social policies, we have to make them care about these kind of things and have to make them accept us, because eventually you want atheism to gain political traction within a conservative community and context. Hence, fundamentally more understanding than previous popes is what Pope Francis is trying to do. That what he's trying to push towards Catholics is that at least abortion is forgivable under these circumstances instead of the absolute of how abortion is not forgivable. This is a lot better for women who to be able to at least gain some sort of access towards abortion when they have the Zika virus. This means more abortions can happen in a state where Pope Francis is largely an influence, and hence this is a lot better than them not having access to any of these things at all. Hence, when you try to denounce Pope Francis about his little concessions of liberal values, is going to regress as an atheist movement. That you are not going to help any of the atheists at all. That you're only going to fight fire with fire, and it's never going to work. Eventually, when you do not, at least as a minority, try to understand and try to gain traction through the common ground that you have, then you are going to then disallow power on your side, and you are pushing away power that is freely given to you by Pope, because at least the words he used is the same rhetoric as what you support. Hence, the rhetoric used will then be able to spread more ideologies and be more understanding and open. Now, moving on to how these people are always really ostracized and how it reversed the harms. The misrepresentation of atheism will then reduce in Catholic communities. And why is it important? The atheism is always misrepresented, and this is why it's such an idea and ideology that is always pushed against religion as to how we worship Satan, or you do not support praying and how praying doesn't work. These kind of things push people away from the atheist movement. And if you do want to gain traction or gain acceptance or gain followers in your case, this is a very bad marketing strategy plan for you to be able to gain and convince people that you are correct within today's political world. Hence, it is very important for us to accept and at least find a common ground between us and forgive the concessions that he makes. Thank you.
Thank the Leader of Opposition, and to continue the debate, we invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
Panel, the world is not as religious as it was before, right? That is a concession that opposition has to make. Atheism has been gaining traction, Catholicism has been losing support and followers. 3 facts. Number 1, Catholicism is declining in US, Philippines, and Singapore, right? Like in the 1980s, 80% of the population identified as Catholics compared to 2014, where it was only 30%. More young generation nowadays identify as atheists more than ever because they rejected the old and rigid doctrines of Catholicism. Ted Cruz lost to someone who was criticized by the Pope and whom the Pope explicitly said was not fit to be president, right? The Republicans can't even stop Planned Parenthood anymore. They don't have enough quorum to overturn Jafel, which allowed gay marriages, and now Republicans are more focused on economic issues instead of religion. Secondly, so this debate is essentially about not that atheism is winning. Do we push ahead and continuously use proven methods to destroy the remains of Catholicism, or do we concede now and allow them some breathing room and allow it some illiberal value to stay? Secondly, Pope Francis's influence is ineffective in the US. They still want to get gay marriages banned from homosexuality. They still don't accept refugees, even though Pope Francis explicitly asked them to accept refugees. They promoted a climate change denier into office, even though Pope Francis says Christians should do something about it. They still want to defund Planned Parenthood, right? This shows across the majority of Catholics, Pope Francis has minimal impact. The only one who is enhanced and enchanted by Pope Francis's rhetoric are your liberals who wouldn't even convert into Catholicism, right? If you notice, everyone else who was championing Pope Francis were liberals who don't even identify as Catholics, but like they fail to see that Pope Francis is ineffective. But thirdly, the followers who are persuaded by liberals, the followers who are persuaded into Catholicism by Pope Francis are fickle, right? They follow Pope Francis's word just because he is Pope. There is then a real risk that a more conservative Pope in the future would overturn all these like liberal values that Pope Francis held. For example, if you have another Pope Benedict, and therefore they cannot be trusted as allies, we are willing to forsake them if it means pushing on to destroy Catholicism. Before I look on to the effects of denouncing, let's engage in a few rebuttals. Firstly, they said, at least we engage in conservative communities. Like, I've already proven to you how Pope Francis has not much influence in the majority of conservative societies. Why is it? So, number one, you can't overturn thousands of years of indoctrination and tens of popes with just a sudden one liberal pope, right? But secondly, your majority rank and file, your churches in the US and Philippines are still conservative. They still preach hate, regardless of what Francis said, and they will continuously do so. Thirdly, your text is illiberal and frigid, right? Even though Pope Francis says things that are against religious texts, most Christians still prefer to stay by the Bible. The only ones who are enchanted by Pope Francis are your liberals and those people who are opposed against conservatism. And we think when these people are enchanted, they will reduce their attacks, and we think this is harmful because you are tricked into believing that Catholicism can change from within, when the fact that it cannot change from within, right? But secondly, they said atheism will not be harmed by conservatives. Hello, atheists have always opposed religion, even in conservative countries, and they don't do it because like they'll be opposed. They do it because they fight for what is right? Which means they've always opposed and they will still oppose it, right? But under your side, like you make the fight which they've been fighting for much harder because other people believe that maybe we should engage with them instead. This would actually like make the fight even more ineffective. But lastly, they said at least Pope Francis has some policies that are friendly to liberals. Number one, like most people don't adopt those policies anyway. But number two, even if it is effective, we reject that because it's only a substandard right? Even though Pope Francis says you shouldn't condemn homosexuals, but they will never be allowed to marry if you allow Catholicism to continue as a political bloc. So we prefer a world where we reduce their influence instead and continue with all our efforts in the past that has been very ineffective. But before that, opening.
Contradictory in your context. You said that Ted Cruz was someone who the Pope criticized, and then now they are fighting against gay marriage in liberal context. So exactly how big, under your side, do you define as Pope's influence?
Yeah, Pope Francis has no influence on the majority of conservative Christians. The only one who think he has influence are your liberals who champion him as maybe a bridge to engage with conservative. And as a result, they have actually like dampened their efforts to continue pushing out atheism and pushing out Catholicism and continuously attack Catholicism and make it irrelevant, right? We reject that. We'll tell people, so what's the effect of denouncing? We tell liberals that it is ineffective to change religion from within. It is a lost cause as you can never achieve it. We tell them that Pope Francis is not the Messiah that we are looking for, right? That if he is not only is he ineffective, but he still upholds a multitude of illiberal values and upholds religious texts, which will never change. We tell them that the allies you get now in the Catholicism movement are not only a minority, but they are fickle because they only listen to the Pope, and they will turn against you once a more conservative Pope is elected. They are not dependent allies. And we will continue the effects that we have made to persuade people away from Catholicism that's been so effective so far, continuously attacking religion, trying to take the text backs away and push them into irrelevance. So what do you think we are able to do under our side? Number one, we galvanize liberals to oppose Catholicism as a whole, right? Like we reject the bridge and we just say we'll continue all our efforts. For example, we just continuously launch our campaigns, our engagement. We'll continuously persuade the young people that, like the young generation, that Catholicism is not the answer, that atheism is the answer. We'll continuously oppose all Catholic proposals. For example, try to imbue some sort of creationism in the school textbooks. We'll oppose the influence in parliament, in education, and in politics as a whole. Secondly, we stop liberals from opting into Catholicism. We know condemnation probably don't work against the people who have been condemned against. Most people won't change anyway. But condemnation is also communication to a third party and society at large, right? I think when atheists condemn Pope Francis, we convince other people that opting into Pope Francis's false brand of Catholicism is a bad idea, and that if you're opposed against certain tenets of religion, the answer is not to compromise, but the answer is to oppose instead. Lastly, we prevent atheist movements and liberals from investing in a futile cause, right? We say you can't go against thousands of years of indoctrination. You should invest all your efforts instead into opposing Catholicism, which has been working so well in the past. Mr. Speaker, not only is Pope Francis ineffective, but the only people who believe that he's effective are the liberals who have dampened their opposition to Catholicism. I think under our side, we galvanize support, we reject the false messiah, and we continuously push atheism into the irrelevancy that it is already like halfway there. For all those reasons, we are very opposed.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and to conclude the opening half of the debate, we invite Deputy Leader of Opposition.
The reason why liberals support the stances and the changes Pope Francis made, even though they are far from perfect, is because it is still in some way changing. It's not as bad as the stances of Pope Benedict, which ostracizes the atheist community or the LGBT community to its fullest extent, but to some extent, Pope Francis accepts them. We recognize that even though it's not perfect, it's still something we should stand for. This side, the stances from this side were literally echoing the new atheistic movement. And if you read, the new atheistic movement is a more radical wing of atheism that we oppose. We would say that that form of rhetoric coming from their side would actually harm the atheist movement in the long run, and we would give you reasons why. So 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, the settings and the context of the world now. Is it better? Is it worse? Secondly, we're going to be talking about the atheist community. Would they harm the atheist community? And thirdly, I would explain why your stance increased the distrust between Pope Francis in the Vatican City and within the Catholic community, who have already been suspicious of atheist people, but Pope Francis has accepted them. Most of the issues will be integrated, but let's look at the few things that don't fit in. Firstly, they mentioned that the statistics in the world of religious people, whether Catholic or whatsoever, is declining. Sure, we accept that statistic, but that statistic and that fact is literally very absolutist and discredits how there are countries in the world that are still inherently religious. Countries like Uganda, Kenya, or Nigeria are still extremely conservative and still hold the Christian values in this most radical form. Their side excludes those kind of circumstances and only takes their case at a very best scenario. They say that things don't change. We disagree on this, and this is why I told you in my opening line that liberals are actually happy with this. Because you can't actually prove that nothing will change, given that the trends show that things are changing. The Catholic Church was pretty stagnant in the past 1,000 of years, but then suddenly you have a person pushing this idea forwards. But let's assume that this still does not change. We say that their side literally advocates for a one-day change or thing that would not happen in an institutional religion where they have to slowly change their doctrines. But lastly, they said condemnation is good. I would explain in my issues why this is not that, because they are literally assuming that everyone will be happy with you condemning those kind of people, even though religion is something they hold extremely dearly to themselves. I'll take one later. Let's look at the settings now, because Alex gave you a lot of reasons why the world right now, though not perfect, it's still comparatively better than the world in the past. Although the Catholic Church still does not approve of gay marriages, at least they are saying we should accept them into our church. We should give communion to them. We should listen to their confession. And Pope Francis openly visited one of his gay students last year. Their only response was, but again, still gay marriages are not given. We recognize that that's a very sad fact, but at least something is changing and conditions are much better than last time. Last time, literally, the Catholics will just shut them out, and in extreme cases of Uganda and Kenya, these people will be lynched. Right now, you have the head of the church telling them, don't do that, love them, accept them. So that does not happen under their side, where they see that the atheist people are directly attacking on them. But next, they said you can't really change these people because of levels and years of indoctrination. This is true, but that can change, right? Because like what you characterized earlier on, like this Pope is this infallible leader within the Catholic Church. So if he actually says something, it forces people to reconsider. They might not accept it at this point in time, but given the context of Catholicism, they would have to accept those kind of views eventually. No, thank you. But lastly, the mention of liberalization can only occur with discourse. This directly contradicts with their idea of how you should condemn, right? But firstly, we say that liberalization still happens on the outside because progressives like the Pope and certain few gay Irish priests are still currently changing the conditions within it. But second, even if it does not, like, we recognize that conditions right now are unfortunate, but this is possible because when religion change, they must be in control of their doctrine. The moment people see this as atheists directly attacking their doctrine as a whole, people will more likely see that their doctrine is being under attack of atheism. They'll more likely shut out the atheist community because they think you are hampering their doctrines which they held dear. We POI then about the Anglican and Lutheran churches. They didn't really respond. Because if you look at the context of how they changed, it wasn't really only about discourse. It was only because people did not really bother and mess up with their doctrines, and that forced them and gave them the ability to change because they realized that their religion is not under attack and it's time to change because we need to accept other people. So settings now may not be perfect, it's still comparatively better. Sure.
Conservatives in the Philippines, which still criminalizes divorce and rejects refugees, it's clear that they don't listen to Pope Francis. Why should we not launch the militant atheist campaign that has been so effective in the US against them?
Okay, now let's talk about the atheist community. We gave you a lot of examples why there are atheist people living in purely religious and conservative society and the ostracization they face. They want, and that's what their POI again, to like a militant brand of atheism that opposes religion. Here's where they need to recognize the distinction of two atheist movements. You have the mainstream atheist movement and you have the new atheist movement. The mainstream atheist movement are more like basically more legitimate. They accept the views of others. They think that the view of not having an afterlife is their own choice. But the new form of atheism is more radical and directly attack people for not being part of their beliefs. This makes the atheist movement shift towards that narrative because they see that this is a radical movement that they should not accept. So their side literally harms it because at the point where people believe that the atheist community is directly attacking you is also the point where they ostracize atheists even more. And this reverses all the progress that has been done. Because while atheist community, yeah, they're still ostracized, but that is comparative lesser than what has been happening right now with Pope Francis leading the Catholic Church. Your side reverses that. But lastly, how this increases distrust within Pope Francis. We need to recognize that the stances of Pope Francis and whatever he suggests are always vetoed by pro-conservative cardinals. Their side literally reverses the progress within Vatican. Because right now, there are cardinals that, yeah, they don't really agree with Pope Francis' point of view, but at the point where they see that Pope Francis being nice to the atheist community and the atheist community attacking them back is the point where the cardinals would completely distrust Pope Francis. This will also happen within the congregation of the Catholic Church where they just believe that Pope Francis is a nutcase, whatever he said will not work. Their side loses all progress of change that has been going. It removes the avenue for change. We are very proud to not oppose his view of Catholicism.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and to open the closing half of the debate, invite Member of Government. Here.
I'll open it for you.
That's okay, I'll put the chair to.
Can you turn it off, Berat? Can you turn it off?
You don't do can't.
All right.
Press one button. Half the campus doesn't have it.
He doesn't like the cold.
Neither do I. Schools and government will enter this debate by finally discussing what are the incentives of an individual who does identify as an atheist, and why is it so pernicious that this sort of strategic ambiguity that the Pope currently operates on, and why we think that language harms discourse. I'm going to also tell you exclusively why we think an atheist engaging in this particular policy allows for us to have comparative distinctions to the communities of atheists that exist around the world, and providing a more comprehensive overview of what atheism looks like. All my rebuttals will be integrated for opening opposition, but I have two rebuttals that don't fit in. One, they wanted to provide a distinction that this debate is also about individuals who are, so there's a distinction between new atheists and less radical atheists. I'm going to make this claim that new atheists or more militant groups of atheism that are headed by individuals who are prominent, like Richard Dawkins, are already groups of individuals who actively criticize the Catholic Church and its position to begin with anyway. So I don't think this debate is just specifically about these groups of individuals. But secondly, when you're talking about reversing the progress of the Catholic Church and harming the relationship between the Pope and the cardinals, I don't think the duty solely relies on an atheist to ensure that the trust between the Pope and the cardinal remains the same. But secondly, I think this already exists in status quo, and the reason why cardinals don't like some of the policies that the Pope may or may not want to begin with is because there are Catholic followers who already criticize the Pope, right? So it's not as if the Catholic Church suddenly en masse already follows all the progressive beliefs that the Pope currently speaks about. First thing, why do we think the strategic ambiguity that the Pope currently operates on harms individuals? Let's look at the language in which the Pope currently utilizes to apparently create distinctions in status quo. Opening gave you some, I'm going to give you more. So apparently, homosexuals can go to heaven, but the discussion is about whether or not they can even love each other or even marry in the church, right? That's something that the Pope doesn't talk about. So contraceptives, as the Pope says, can be a good thing, but he never discussed whether a person who enjoys premarital sex should also have access to contraceptives. He acknowledged the autonomy of women to be able to make their own decisions, but just a few weeks ago, he said that the ban on women being ordained as priests in the Catholic Church is an eternal ban and something that should not be overturned because it is just the word of God. No, thank you. I think this appeals to followers for many different reasons, right? Because I think contrary to opening government, the Catholic Church is something that's still quite popular in status quo. That's why you still have millions of individuals who flock to the Vatican City on the pit stop of their Euro trip in order for them to see that old guy ringing a bell on the balcony, right? But why does it specifically appeal to followers? It appeals to them because it appeals to the moral crisis that often individuals who are within a particular religion currently feel. So there are people who feel like, I really love God and I do want to believe in all the tenets of what God tells me and what the Bible and the Quran tells me. But at the same time, they also believe in the values of humanity and empathy and acknowledging that there are individuals who are currently circumvented for their rights under religion. So these are people like me who think that religion is really important, but also believe in the rights of the homosexual community in order for them to be able to access the right for them to love each other. What does this strategic ambiguity do? One is that it soothes, subdues, and placates these followers who think, at this point, we do have a compromise. At this point, we do have some possession. So I think the intellectual discourse and the ability to piece apart the religion as to whether or not they're actually granting rights to individuals doesn't happen because it stops short at the point at which they say there is some progressiveness in the Catholic Church, right? So even if they don't discriminate individuals explicitly, they do it tacitly as well by opposing particular policies that may necessarily harm individuals of the minority by electing leaders into power who may carry out the policies that explicitly discriminate against these communities, right? But I think the sort of rationale that followers often engage upon when they are discussing minority rights and whether or not individuals are currently harmed by the church are going to be circumvented at the point at which we place a label of progressiveness based on three statements that don't really mean anything in status quo. Secondly, what are the incentives of an atheist, right? Specifically this one. I think as an individual that identifies as an atheist, when you categorically denounce, it's not just you being able to individually say, I explicitly do not accept any exception to how we view current methods of engagement that the church currently operates on, but it's also about you going out and telling people, this is something that I disagree on. But what is the precursor, right? That you must have made the conscious decision to adopt the identity as an atheist, that you must have made the conscious decision to identify and come out and reach to people and have some intellectual discourse or some discussion as to whether or not it's even accurate to begin with, right? And I think this even happens in a lot of conservative societies like Malaysia, like Pakistan, like India, when you have a rising growth of individuals who do identify as an atheist, but what is good about them is that there are people who can have like civilized discussion as well as intellectual discourse about whether or not atheism is something that is important and whether or not it's challenging the construct of the Catholic Church, right? So I think the backlash that First Op was talking about in this debate already exists to these individuals, but I don't think these are people who are currently deterred by the backlash or the criticism that the society tells them. But what is the motivation of this atheist, right? I think one is to break people from the shackles of governance that is led by an amorphous being and based on a text that propagates the ability for us to have thought prisons and capture individuals to be unable to think beyond a particular point. So I think a lot of the times people take a position of saying that the sort of compromises and the mediation that the Pope currently engages on is something that's legitimate because at least it's a middle ground between me and my religion, without ever acknowledging perhaps that it isn't even accurate to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, I think we have to know in this debate that the atheist doesn't want to create an atheist caliphate, right? They don't want a movement that actively converts people into atheism. In fact, they rejected attempts to create the mega atheist church that was introduced in 2013. What does this tell you? Often they don't have an incentive to actively tell people, yo bro, leave your religion and become an atheist just like me. What they want to do is to engage with people and with like factual claims as well as empirical data to show that perhaps there is something wrong with what you're believing in. Perhaps you need to start piecing apart your religion, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not what you believe in is based on something that's real or based on something that's created by individuals. They want to inculcate some discussion that allows for people to challenge the norm of what they think about religion in status quo. So I think this whole conversion that opening opposition seems to want to talk about doesn't exist in status quo. What are the outcomes? One, I think they can challenge that thought prison that stops individuals from being able to introspect as to whether or not the mediation and the mitigation that we currently engage on as a Catholic Church is one that's sufficient. But two, I think you also have some obligation as well, especially for individuals who are followers of that religion, who do face that moral crisis, who find it hard to challenge and voice it out. But I also think it provides a comparative as to the groups of atheists that exist in status quo. What you do as an individual is you piece apart and say perhaps there are groups of individuals who can engage in intellectual discourse that can create a comparative between the statements that is given by the church and perhaps don't have to engage by absolutely telling you that you're wrong, but perhaps there are some questions that you need to have towards the church, right? I think it's very difficult for people to be able to claim discourse at the point in which the Catholic Church, the Pope, and individuals in the higher up can plausibly deny the changes that needed to be made by that church if they can say that some compromises have already been done. As an atheist, you have an obligation to break that thought prison.
We thank the member of government to continue the debate. We invite the member of opposition. Stay here.
Too much of this debate has been on the benefits of having discourse happen without actually much analysis as to how discourse happens and whether it's better on which side. Two main things in my speech today. One, on the incentive of atheists not to denounce Pope Francis. Two, on how taking an antagonistic stance is harmful and regresses the atheist movement. But first, a few things to clear up. So atheists are also people that dislike certain harmful conservative values. So move on to some rebuttals. So on to member of Gov. So they claim that a tacit opposition is bad. Okay, you can see, but it's better than outright opposition when you take an antagonistic stance and you push them into a situation where they are forced to retaliate in a certain way. So sure, a lot of the benefits are just benefits of discourse, but they never really told us exactly how it's better on their side. On to opening. So there's a principal inconsistency when they said
that they wanted churches and mosques to be more accepting, because if they were principally consistent, they would denounce all religious institutions, because they never provided a clear distinction between the Pope's church and every other church and mosque there is in the status quo. So when they talk about pandering, listen, the way pandering works is by taking into account the concerns of the people that you're targeting, which means that their side doesn't do any pandering, their side only antagonizes and makes enemies out of the people that they want to adopt atheist values. So they need to prove how outright opposing and dismissing these people is actually productive. On to my first argument on how it is an incentive of atheists not to denounce the Pope. So in the status quo, the Pope acts as a central authority, a direct link to God. The Pope's word is powerful. Secondly, the Pope has also taken progressive stances on certain things like homosexuality, condoms, climate change. So if you're going to talk about ambiguity, the important thing to notice here is, at least with ambiguity, there is some softening of the Pope's stance as opposed to nothing happening under their side. Thirdly, the Pope also acts as a representative of Catholicism, right? So the reach of the Pope to communities that oftentimes don't get exposed to a lot of information outside the communities is not comparable to any sort of other ways of reaching those communities. Also, non-Catholic groups like liberal LGBT groups and say the secular US government also have a place to focus their attention on whenever they want to bring change to a certain religious community. So to achieve the atheist ideals of humanistic values being imbued into these Catholics, they need the Pope. Why? Firstly, because the Pope is the best way to communicate with Catholics all over the world. Why? The comparative I offer you is this. It is difficult to convince a religious conservative person to adopt atheist values right off the bat. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of analysis, a lot of persuasion. So two things to note here. One, when you can do it through the Pope, you then have the focus versus a scattered effort that does not trickle down anywhere. At least it's equally hard to get the average Catholic and the Pope, let's just say for the sake of discussion, to convince them of atheist values. But if you convince these scattered people who are not the Pope, these people, even if they accept those values, are unlikely to be able to influence people on as large a scale as the Pope is able to. Secondly, the Pope's authority. So when the Pope makes statements, the whole global Catholic community listens and takes note of it, talks about these things. No. So how is this likely to accrue benefits? So the Pope and the Catholic Church has shown a trend of softening up on major issues. So they don't need to give us clear stances. All they have to show is that they are softening up. Because even if they claim that softening up is not that great, that's why when they antagonize people, people harden their stances. So the church has also shown some openness to change. For example, on LGBT rights and climate change, no. So the reach the Pope has also far outweighs the ability of the average atheist. What do we mean? Because the church is very rich, they have a lot of money, they do all sorts of charity, missions, all that stuff. So the most conservative communities who are hard to reach, who cannot be reached by other means, are under their side, are also lost on their side. So this means that the most desirable people, because atheists are driven mostly by the humanistic values, are not touched on their side. Because it is the most conservative religious people that atheists want to make an impact on. No. Second argument on how to take an antagonistic stance is harmful. So the problem is it becomes harder to engage on an intellectual level with enemies, with people with outright opposing ideologies. So Catholics become angered and they become unwilling to listen, at which point they become dismissive. Same thing happens with atheists. They become angered, unwilling to listen, dismissive. So the discourse becomes toxic. How does this happen? So instead of building an intellectual fort, they fight to demolish each other's stances, which is not very productive. The discussion is marred and hate, at which point liberal atheists will be deemed privileged snobs who call conservatives regressive, sexist bigots. At which point these Catholics are going to be very turned off by this toxicity. So when Catholics feel unheard, they take a more hardline stance. Before I go on, closing.
Atheists don't have any incentive to convert people into atheism. They want to challenge the ideals that you have when you follow a religion, right? To what end would an atheist have to construct their language of compromise to the degree that they don't get any backlash from an individual?
Firstly, I never said anything about converting them. My speech was on humanistic values that we want to imbue to these communities. Secondly, when you don't compromise, and when these people see God as everything, it's highly likely that they'll be unable to accept certain things. You bring these changes and values into them by stages so that it becomes easier and more palatable for them to take those changes in. So when these Catholics are turned off, they feel unheard, they take more hardline stances. For example, perhaps they'll clamp down even harder on liberal values. For example, LGBT rights, women's rights, birth control, abortions. At which point, when they are pushed into desperation, they'll take more drastic radical actions to gain attention. At which point, they become hyper-religious. At which point, it becomes even harder to imbue all the humanistic values that we want to imbue to them. So the comparative is this, even if the progress on our side is slower, what's important that it is more certain. So the best case is that they have some progress, but it's at the expense of immeasurable collateral damage, and they would have to be okay with escalating violent hate crimes that happen from people feeling cornered and have no other options to be heard. For example, arson in extreme circumstances, lynching in extreme cases. The most important thing that you have to take away from this debate is this. The Pope acts as an authority, a means of communication that people listen to. Secondly, they also make enemies of the people they want to imbue humanistic values into their lives.
We thank the member of opposition. To conclude the government side, we invite government. Here.
As an atheist, I may never agree that the choice of a woman can be limited. As an atheist, I may never agree that love is only selectively beautiful for heterosexual couples. As an atheist, I may never agree that women, being the beautiful and magnificent being that they are, should never be the leader of a community like religion. We have to always ask ourselves throughout the course of this debate as to what are the obligations of the particular atheist and what would the goal be of this particular atheist. We do not think principally that this atheist should ever compromise with the kind of compromises that they want under that side of the house. Like saying that maybe contraception is a thing, but at the same time denying the fact that there may be some more choices that a woman should be able to be entitled to. Given that, one important question I will answer in my speech, direct extension to closing opposition will be integrated as well as my engagement with opening opposition, which is that where would conservative and religious values be in this debate as to what the atheists may want them to be? No, thank you. So let's first deal with the opposition in this debate, the whole crux of the case from the opposition. They say that religious values and radical values, and so on, will be severely diluted for the reasons of we can engage with the conservative culture. There's some antagonism towards the atheists, so therefore, at the very least, we get some change, and that's a good thing. To which we say a few things. The first thing I like to point out, no thank you, is that until the end of this debate, the only change that they can get from that side of the house is maybe perhaps certain behaviors that the atheists would like be acceptable, or that certain values that the atheists would like would be acceptable. We would like to first of all point out that there is still ambiguity as to what the positions of all the other values that this particular atheist may want is when it comes to this particular community. And the reason for this ambiguity, as rightfully pointed out by Jay, is because of the language in which the Pope actually uses when conveying this message to these people. But the thing is, it's not definitive in nature. For example, he may say that contraception is a thing, but never necessarily explicitly denounce the explicit things that are in the Bible in regards to the choice of a woman, in regards to anything that is antithetical to the liberals and atheists in general. This means that all the things that a atheist would want to fight for, which is directly antithetical to the Catholic religion, is not addressed, is not explicitly confronted by the Pope, and therefore not explicitly confronted by people of the Catholic religion as well. No, thank you. This means that I, as an atheist who have an obligation to the things that I believe in, and an atheist who have some obligation to myself as an atheist, would not be able to solve that particular obligation. Because while softening does exist under that side of the house, the realization as to what is wrong with the core tenets of that religion still exist, and there will not be an address as to whether it is wrong or whether it is right or not. So in principle, what the atheists should be fighting for, in conclusion, is not the very things that they wanted to achieve at the end of this debate. But let's look at the second part of this issue, which is the things that they want to achieve, which is religion being more palatable, people may be able to change, therefore progressiveness will be able to win, right? The thing is, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, the problem that they've had with the way in which an atheist will want to denounce Pope Francis is because of the kind of interaction and the kind of conversation, as well as the kind of reception that people of this particular religion may have. Like, for example, the toxic discussion, like, for example, the direct antagonism, like, for example, discrediting the words of an atheist, and so on. But first of all, that assumes that this particular reaction is not productive in of itself. We say, and we've already said this, it is productive, no thank you, primarily because of the fact that it confronts people of the Catholicism religion, as well as people who may be on the fence because they have this moral dilemma that maybe perhaps certain humanistic values should be respected, but at the same time I want to respect the words of the Bible as well, because it gives them a comparison, it gives them a contrast as to what sorts of problem does exist in religion, what sorts of problem exists in the core tenets of that religion itself. We say that this particular comparative is extremely important, because without which, and if you say that the words of the Pope is still good because of all of its softening values as well, then there will never be any confrontation of this particular individual with the core tenets of the Bible. No confrontation of this individual with the core tenets of the very things that are antithetical to the things that we as liberals actually fight for. And we think that there is a huge problem because it silences their possibility of being able to confront with this particular rhetorics, and this is extremely important. I'll take opening.
Why is that ambiguity extremely bad if it's more open to interpretation under your side?
It's because it's more open to interpretation that it's a bad thing. Because now I can say things like, oh, certain things are selectively good, like, for example, contraception, or, for example, homosexual may possibly being in heaven. Oh, but at the same time, I can also interpret it as homosexuals are still bad, or perhaps the behavior in of itself is still bad. Point is, because it's ambiguous, it allows itself to be misinterpreted by any conservative or by anyone of the Catholic religion, because of the fact that there is no definitive words or no definitive counter-narrative to say that whatever it is that you're believing in its totality is wrong in of itself. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it's extremely important for us to realize this. So at the end of this debate, what we have to consider is that the whole entire goal that exists on the government bench, which is to say, on the opposition bench, which is to say that we are at the very least are able to be to bring in some level of moderation into the particular context or into the particular society that we're talking about, fails under that side of the house. And the reason for this is because no matter how progressive you are able to make an entire community to be, it still doesn't end the fact that the minorities, for example, in that area, that still doesn't fit in with the things that the Pope still say is wrong. Like, for example, maybe perhaps women who really does want to be the priest, for example, are still marginalized and are still impacted by the very facade of progression and the very facade of liberalism that exists under that side of the house. But more importantly, this is not something that we as an atheist would want to compromise as well. Never will we ever want to compromise on the fact that there are just certain things that are directly important to humanity and the values of humanity, because that some ends or some utility that they want to achieve. Very high.
We thank the government whip, and to conclude this debate, we invite opposition whip. arguably a huge reason why a lot of people left Catholicism in recent years or recent times is because they can't relate, because they're shamed, they're ostracized by these people, and the church decided to adopt a new strategy to get them in. I think Pope Francis is probably better in line with the views of atheism, and that's what we'll support on our side, because there is no turning back if we repel moderates away, just as the church did long ago when they decided to impose higher taxes for people that you should sacrifice to God, and as such. We will fight for the world or an atheism cause that doesn't go so aggressive, because we believe this will bring some better change. I'll deal with closing government first, then I'll deal with opening government issue. But before that, let's talk about what wasn't engaged in Jen's speech, or why is it so important. So Jen told you that softening up on major issues was the biggest goal, or the biggest change that we could actually ask for from the Catholic Church, and why does it turn into our favor as atheists here? Because you don't need to show that they're against something, or at least you give the leeway for members of Catholicism to explore exposure to what it is. They claim that they don't have a burden to prove that atheism can gain or garner more support, but we believe they do. Because if you do believe that atheism should run and lobby for all these things, like the rights of individuals or the LGBT movement, then you also must say that atheism has a duty or right to also rile in members to join the atheist community and to be absolute by it. We think that's a cop-out from their side. But the second thing that Jen talked to you about was how Catholics turn more radical in their world, Catholics turn more radical in their world. First thing we'll say that is because in Vietnam and Thailand, the churches that you'd say that are really bad will become worse, because they'll denounce atheism, because they also denounce Catholicism in your world if they believe that you are true, that this version of Catholicism is wrong as well. We believe that all efforts to change in certain areas will be crippled or digress in this situation. I'll talk to you more about it in my issues as well. No, thank you. Let's talk about closing government first. This first idea about strategic ambiguity. The first thing we'll say, if it's true that the Catholic Church is so huge in your context that you claim, this doesn't make sense that you rile them up against them and it'll leave you no support. Meaning, in the LGBT communities or the LGBT talks and runs in the US right before the law was passed, right, we believe that many of them were from churches as well who did believe in the LGBT movement but were moderates and on the fence. You lose all that support if you do rile and be aggressive against them, and you give them no reason to want to support atheism or support the LGBT movement, because it is correlated with each other that liberal values can only exist with atheism in your world that you propagate there. You're likely to divorce the LGBT communities because half of them don't believe in you anymore, and you create separatism within liberal issues and facets within them, which you don't think you gain any traction at all or less traction, because you don't gain as much political support as a general liberal value being lobbied for itself on the streets compared to an atheist liberal value on the streets. The second issue is that if it's true that incentives of atheists, if it's true that they don't have incentive to bring in more people, we believe that it is true that they want to break the shackles of government. We believe that they will have to lobby for more government change as such. Because if they aren't aggressive if they are under an aggressive umbrella, what happens is that they have no support, and the conclusion is that they are likely to prefer lobbying for more autonomous and individual rights rather than to reject the whole thing as such anyway. Let's talk about what atheists are up for and how this ambiguity argument came out from Izzat's speech. First question, why does it really have to be addressed? We believe that the core tenets are not radical now, meaning the acceptance of atheism is much better within moderates of the Catholic Church. This because there's better exposure to liberal values in conservative states at this point. If you don't rile them up or you don't make conservative states hate atheism in any way, they're more likely to not burn the gay man or murder him on the streets as well. We think that is fine, and that should be a priority of the atheist community if it means that denouncing God would also mean upholding the liberal values of individuals on the ground. But let's talk about this idea of no confrontation at all. If your confrontation is bad because it affects the conservatives in the church as well, we believe that it's better on our side because you're still under the control of the conservative church, meaning you're likely to lose a following. You forever taint the name of atheism in anyone's eyes in the conservative church, and you give them no reason to want to convert to your side as well. You give them one more reason to hate you, and for the whole generation, or as they claim that will never believe in you, we believe there's no turning back in this issue. Before I move on, Joe.
Pope Francis' facade of liberalism conceals the fact that
Catholics don't listen to him and protects the illiberal fraction of Catholicism from attack and criticism from atheists. Not only internal change is ineffective on your side, you lose momentum on external change as
So
well.
it's ineffective, but we believe that it's better than nothing, right? So in the world where there's no change at all, or there's no lobbying from Pope Francis, we believe that gay people will still be burned at all. And we believe that atheism will also be a more like standard or more moderate version of the liberal world, and people will be more likely to follow them. If Pope Francis is there as a liberal and as a moderate as well, and if you go against him and row against him, and if you seem very unreasonable in any sense, people don't want to follow you as well. Let's talk about opening government and how their coercion argument, and how which discussion is better or what's more important for atheists as well. We will argue to you that humanizing value preaching is better for acceptance purposes. Why? Because it is more reasonable and is able to gain some standing ground. People don't denounce atheism or attach them to an aggressive narrative here. What happens? The comparative is simple. They get shamed for being a Catholic and you don't want to join atheism, or you don't want to be a gay person anymore, you don't want to help a gay person out anymore. Discussions on the ground are more dismissive because attacks are now based on Pope Francis, not about the discussions of values going on the ground. We believe that this is far more regrettable on their side. But they argue to you that there's still no acceptance going on. If that is true, then Pope Francis is on the same fight as you, no? The first thing we'll say is that you can overthrow the years of indoctrination. Because if you say that people convert in recent times and like people are more accepting of change, then you can and you should follow that line of acceptance anyway. The reason why they convert is because of a radical version of Catholicism that exists and they don't want to be a part of it, so they'd rather join something more moderate in that way. But if we in ourselves as atheists turn more radical and extremist, people wouldn't join us in any sense. We believe that all the benefits they want to accrue there, or all the harms that they want to talk about the Pope itself, we think they're irrelevant if you can't prove to us the logical link of how it's going to happen in the first place, which is why Jen told you they won't be accepting in any way, and that's a far worse harm in itself. The next thing we'll say, that is not the point that you galvanize liberals to oppose or you stop them from opting into liberal values. Because the best case is if they can join you because you row them up against the Pope. That is a failure of the atheist community to give you a true, genuine sense of what atheism is. It's not about hating on Christians, it's about upholding liberal values to the best extent as possible. You misrepresent atheism to the large community of people you coerce. We think that's the biggest shame to the atheist community. We cannot accept this. We invite all 40 cross the floor, shake hands. Thank you guys for the debate.
You're sick.
You are. Good debate. Thank you.